Hello, my thriving members. I'm Catherine Lizardo, the creator of the Thriving ADHD Mompreneurs community. Welcome to Module 1. Module 1 is the letter T in our Thrive framework, which stands for Tune In. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read what's on the slide first and then expand on them. I'm explaining that because our ADHD brains need to be primed so that we're ready to get started. Let's dig in. Welcome to Module 1, where you'll reframe your ADHD by reclaiming your story. Module 1 is where we'll understand ADHD through a compassionate lens. Now, here's the key takeaway that you're going to learn in Module 1. The first one is what ADHD really is. Second, we will bust shame-based myths. And third, we will discover your unique strengths. And I'm not talking about superpower. I'm going to explain that more in detail. Now, this is important. Even if you've read about ADHD, still complete this module. Why? Our ADHD brains need reminders of what we know, and our ADHD brains tend to forget. And that's okay. We just need reminders. And this module 1 is your reminder. So let's get started. This is where we are in our Thrive framework. Tune in, understand your ADHD, and reframe your story. So let's talk about what ADHD really is. Of course, there's a very complicated explanation for ADHD, but here we'll touch on the top 4 that I believe is very critical for us ADHD mompreneurs. The first one is about ADHD is a neurodevelopmental difference. ADHD is not a character flaw or lack of effort. I will explain these 4 items in detail. Let me just tell you first what they are. The next one is ADHD is hereditary. It's in our DNA. That's why they can come from either or both of our biological parents. So it's not just the mom or the dad, or it could be both the mom and the dad. ADHD also affects executive functions. I'm sure you've heard of that terminology a lot, so we'll unpack that here. Just as an overview, executive functions impacts our planning, our emotional regulation, and our time awareness. It does not impact our intelligence. And lastly, ADHD is about often being misdiagnosed in women, especially moms who mask symptoms of ADHD through perfection. And I used to be a perfectionist. That was my coping mechanism for my ADHD. So we'll unpack that here as well. So let's start with the first one, neurodevelopmental difference. Brain imaging has shown that there are differences in brain development in those with ADHD and those without. And this is critical because when people think that ADHD is simply environmental or ADHD is it caused by devices or any other external factors, what we see in the brain imaging is actually our brains and the differences between our ADHD brain versus non-ADHD brain. And when scientists talks about differences in our brain, they're talking about delayed brain development. And the brain development for us ADHDers is that our brain size, structure, intensity, and functional levels are different from that of our non-ADHD friends. And this is crucial, the word delayed. That's why I highlighted it here. The delayed brain development shows differences in our brain. It does not mean a disability. Our ADHD brain develops differently. It's delayed in time. That's what I want you to take out of this. It's not delayed, meaning it's delayed as in disabled, delayed, but more of it's delayed in time. And what do I mean by that? The ADHD maturity age is a good example of this. Maturity age for our ADHD brain, some call it the executive age, but again, the term executive function and executive is hard for me to really conceptualize because English is not my first language. Tagalog is. I was born and raised in the Philippines. So culturally and linguistically, executive is difficult for a lot of people in different countries as well. So let's call it, instead of executive age, let's call it as maturity age. So ADHD maturity age, as I wrote here, ADHDers are about 30% to 40% behind their peers when it comes to executive functions. What that means is that our brain is about 30% behind non ADHD brains in development. What I'm doing here is I'm using the 30% of the studies, and ADHD maturity age is not the same as intelligence. People think, oh, it means that when you're mature, that you're smarter. No, we've seen how many people who are intelligent are not really mature yet in certain developments. And the same way with our ADHD maturity age. Another example is I have a 14-year-old. My eldest is 14 years old and he's been diagnosed with ADHD. His brain maturity age is 9.8 years. So even though he's 14 years old, his brain is really about 9 to 10 years old in terms of brain size, in terms of brain development, and in terms of executive function skills. But my son is highly gifted. He is so smart. He's actually at the top 2% of the population worldwide. That's why he's part of the Mensa group, which is an international organization with the top 2% IQ of the population. So as you can see, the maturity age is different from intelligence. And the reason I'm saying this is because we tend to be hard on ourselves saying, why can't I do this? It's because we're just delayed. But it's okay. And as I show in this next slide, you are not behind. You are on ADHD time. It takes us, our brain, a little bit longer to be on the same par as our non ADHD peers because that's just how our brain develops and works. So, in this quick win activity, I wanted to ask you to think about this. Think of a time when you felt different, socially awkward, or out of place. I can think of a time when I was in elementary school or high school, probably around when I was 15 years old, that I was so socially awkward compared to my peers. Now, what was your actual age then? As I mentioned, I was about 15 years old. Now, looking at the ADHD maturity age chart, what was your ADHD maturity age at that time? So when I was 15, my maturity age of my ADHD brain, again, not my intelligence, but my ADHD brain, was about 10 years old. Knowing that now, tell your inner child, you are not behind. You were on ADHD time, and that's okay. You are okay. The reason it's important to understand that is so that we can lift up that shame and guilt we've given ourselves. Looking back when I was 15, how I felt there was some part of me that acted more immature than my 15-year-old peers. And I always felt different. Like, why was I acting that way? Because my brain was literally developing at that time at a 10-year-old, even though I was 15. And that's okay. Even for adults, the same thing is happening. So it's kind of a blessing in disguise for us if you think about it. I'm 47 years old, but let's just say I'm 40 years old because of this graph. So if you're 40, your brain is around 28 years old. So you can say, hey, it's my birthday. I'm 40 years old, but technically I'm 28, just for the fun of it. But just to let you know, this is how our brain develops. That's why ADHD is in our brains. Literally, neurologically, that's how our brain is developing. Now, when you see this cut right here, it's me telling you that I will be cutting up this module one into bite-sized videos so that it's not overwhelming for our ADHD brain and to keep your attention in these short videos. But before you proceed to the next portion of this video, I just want to remind you to please try this quick win activity. With the information that you will learn from me in this course, I hope that you will apply the same skill when you're learning information in other sources. So you've just learned information about our neurodevelopmental differences with our brain, meaning the difference of our brain structure from other ADHDers. So with that information, you have to pause and reflect. What does that mean for me? That's why this quick win activity is here for you to think about that part a, a while ago, years ago, or maybe just last month that happened to you that you felt, wow, I was acting much younger than my age. The reason is probably because your ADHD brain was acting younger, but younger according to your ADHD brain, which was appropriate. So you are not behind, you're just on ADHD time. In our next clip, we'll talk about how ADHD is hereditary or in our DNA.